Today we are going to continue our discussion of hominin evolution and bring us up into the history of our own species, which is Homo sapiens. So we start in the late Pleistocene, which is where we left off. So we have a very harsh climate during this period. We have glaciation, so land masses, as we already discussed, are not as they presently are. Water levels are different. Climate is overall quite different. So first, we don't have any mass migrations of hominin really far north because it's all covered in glacier. Second, in order to survive any climates basically outside of Africa, there has to be what we call cultural mitigation. So there has to be some form of shelter. There has to be some form of clothing in order to protect from the really harsh cold climate. Another thing that we see during this period is more derived hominin fossils. So ancestral is old, derived means it doesn't look like anything that is old. So we classify this period of hominin as Archaic Homo sapiens. This is a little bit confusing because it makes it sound like they were us, but they're us from a long time ago. But actually, morphologically, these are different fossils from what are us. We are modern Homo sapiens. So this is a skull of an Archaic Homo sapien. It's much more rounded and, we say, bulbous. It is gracile, so the bones are about the same thickness as ours. The muscle attachments are similar to ours. It does have a chin, which earlier hominin did not, so that's a derived feature. So he looks very similar to us, this skull. Different enough that we classify them as a different species, and yet relatively similar. So this is derived. It is more modern than it is ancestral. We see the first Archaic Homo sapiens in Africa, and that is actually really important. So then we see Archaic Homo sapiens in Europe after that. So we are going to talk about where we think Homo sapiens evolved, and that becomes a bit of an issue. So, for instance, around 600,000 years ago in Ethiopia, we have a fossil that we classify as an Archaic Homo sapien. In Nadutu, we have one 400,000 years ago, and these are not as derived as the European fossils that we find. In Europe, similar time period, we have in Heidelberg, Germany, Archaic Homo sapiens. Greece, a little bit later than that. So I only show you this just so you see that we have a number of fossils for Archaic Homo sapiens, and that they're found roughly similar time periods, but these are all before modern humans. We see fossils in Asia and India, around 200,000 years ago. So this is a period that we refer to as the Middle Paleolithic, in part because of the different fossils, but remember, Paleolithic means that we're talking about the Stone Age. So this is the Middle Stone Age. So the main reason that we classify it as something different is because of the stone tools, because of the archaeology. So the tools that are being made here are much fancier than the Oldowan and Acheulean tools we talked about in class the other day. The first type of stone tools that are being made during this Middle Stone Age are called Mousterian tools. And they're made with a technique called the Levallois technique. It was named in France, so it's spelled like this, but it's pronounced Levallois. These points, they're the first flake tools that we've talked about, meaning that when there is a core, we always start with a core, that original rock that the tools are being made out of. But when they flake off a piece of rock, they then turn that flake into a tool. So maybe not literally every flake, but many flakes that are being removed from this core are turned into smaller tools, like arrowheads. Well, maybe not arrowheads, but spear points. So smaller stone tools that are used for a wider variety of things. And the way this works is that the technique for making the tools has actually changed. You're no longer banging this hammer stone directly onto the core. We call this a soft hammer technique or an indirect percussion technique, meaning that I may have a hammerstone and I definitely have a core, but between them maybe I hold an antler. And instead of banging on the core with my hammerstone, I bang on the antler, and that breaks off a small piece of rock that is the flake, which I can then, with that antler, fashion into a spear point. So using this different technique, this takes a lot of skill, a lot of reasoning, so we can sort of link this with cognition. If you or I went outside and decided we were going to make a Mousterian point, we would epically fail. This is something that took a lot of practice and a lot of training, and you couldn't just pick it up and make it, without any forethought. So this was a very advanced technique. And ultimately, the way we sort of look at this, on top of whether it's core or flake, and whether it's direct percussion with that hammerstone or indirect, like this is looking at the cutting edge per raw material. So out of that original core rock, the amount of cutting edge we're getting is astronomically higher than we got with the old one or even the Acheulean tools. So that is very important. These are very advanced tools. In addition to just being fancy, in terms of the actual stone, we have the first composite tools. So these are spear points hefted on to large wooden spears. They're not aerodynamic spears, they're thrusting spears. So we say there are throwing spears and thrusting spears. Obviously you throw a throwing spear. Thrusting spears are like stabbing. So these were really useful weapons, but it was not aerodynamic. So you couldn't throw it with any accuracy at all. And this is difficult to discern because wood is, of course, biodegradable. But in Germany, we actually have found preserved composite stone tools and wooden shafts from around 400,000 years ago. So we do have direct evidence of these tools. So this is really a major characteristic of the Middle Stone Age. We have the first composite tools. We're taking multiple things and we're putting them together. So in this picture, you see, there's sinew or something wrapped around this spear point here. But there's also potentially some sort of glue type substance. So it would have been organic, it would have been made, but this is actually very useful as well and very important for us to understand that they're putting together these really separate things into one tool. So it's really taking a lot of planning and cognition to be able to pull this off. With these new tools, we have a whole new thing going on, big game hunting. So we said, yeah, Homo erectus was hunting. Probably on a small scale, they were probably doing a lot of active confrontational scavenging as well. We absolutely 100% know that Archaic Homo sapiens and Neanderthals were big game hunting. So they were using these thrusting spears on megafauna like mammoths and hunting them. So we actually have a lot of sort of elaborate hypotheses about how this worked. But ultimately, because these spears were not throwing spears, they had to get very up close and personal with these megafauna in order to hunt them. And this was very, very dangerous. So this would have been absolutely necessary for survival, or they wouldn't have been willing to take this chance. Part of the reason that this was necessary for survival is because we're talking about this glacial period in the Earth's history where foraging for plants was basically not going to sustain anyone. It was too cold for most plants to grow during the winter, so they would have had some plants during summer months, but in the winter the only food that any of these people, these hominin, would have been from meat, or any stored plants that they may have been able to save. But again, they don't have an abundance of them during the summer, so even saving them wouldn't last them the winter. So hunting these big game was absolutely entirely necessary for survival. And we see artifacts and evidence of this in different regions. We also see some evidence for use of fire. We think that Homo erectus had use of fire. So we know that it had, it was around during this period, but again, I mentioned when we talked about Homo erectus, we're not like flaking flint and creating fire this way. Maybe we're harnessing some wildfire and continuing, moving basically really hot pieces of charcoal type stuff to start a secondary fire somewhere. So in that way it may be controlled, but we don't actually see evidence of being able to create a fire from scratch, if you will. We also, during this time period, movies and books imply to us that everybody's living in caves because caves are safe and caves could have been warm. We actually don't see a ton of evidence for that, in part because every climate, every geographical region, I guess I should say, doesn't actually have access to caves. So they're in only certain areas, caves that groups of people could live in. But we don't see a ton of evidence for that at this period. That's actually something that we see more with modern Homo sapiens in a few 100,000 years. Every once in a while, I like to do a reading rainbow moment. So if you are interested in Homo neanderthalensis, so Neanderthals and modern and archaic hominin and the archaeology involved, these books are like the best in terms of taking actual archaeological evidence and incorporating it into, it's basically prehistoric fiction. So the Clan of the Cave Bear, most people have heard of. It's actually a whole series of books. If you are interested in this at all, these are really, really interesting. They're a really good read, so I encourage you to look them up. All right, we will now continue. This is actually going to be the end of this first installment, so move on to the second installment, and we'll talk about Neanderthals.